We're live and you're watching Howler on YouTube.
Yeah! Where's Vinny? Ah! All right.
All right, guys. This is the long talked about, long awaited, and very much requested review of Crisis on Infinite Earth from 1985. And it's a few days late, basically because this is big. Crisis on Infinite Earth has such a rich history. It had so much happening in the book and around the book, in the real world and the comic book world, and that you know, you had to figure out a way to just streamline it, to stay on target. Because the truth is I could get a big chalkboard here behind me, and I can end up having diagrams taking up the whole chalkboard that would look like some kind of big Albert Einstein math equation, you know, everything that went on. So, first thing, if you guys want to see everything that Crisis involved in the comics, I highly recommend you go out and you find the official Crisis on the Infinite Earth Index. I think it was Kitchen Sink Press. No, I don't know who that is. But anyway, this will list the books that all cross over, all the books that gives explanation, a little history, and it has a checklist on what the Earths were, what comic books crossed over with Crisis or tied in. And with that said, let's go ahead and kick this off so this doesn't turn into a super long video. In January 1985, Crisis on Infinite Earth #1 comes. It's a 12-issue maxi series. This is a time where nothing like this had truly, really been tried. It promised big changes, big death, a lot of hype, a lot of talk, and there were still not a lot of miniseries out at this time. This was still a fresh medium. They had a 12-issue Camelot 3000. Marvel experimented with Nightcrawler and Contest of Champions. Even before this, there was Secret Wars. But Secret Wars technically probably it came out first, but this was the first idea. Okay? That's a whole other video. I got one. I might tag of another video down here where I talk about Pete Sanderson, Who's Who, official guide to the Marvel Universe, Secret Wars, and Crisis. Okay, explaining that. Like I said, a lot was going on. So, this came out. Okay, George Perez, wraparound cover. You'd had sprinkles for years of the Crisis was coming, because you would have a ship, a round orb of a ship with a blonde woman sitting there talking to some mysterious man where you'd only see him in a silhouette. You'd see him from behind. You'd just see a hand, everything like that. And he popped up in comics all throughout Marvel for like about 3 years before this came out. And he was supplying weapons to villains, and he was talking about things that were coming and how he was studying everybody. This turned out to be the Monitor. Okay? The Monitor, just a real quick behind-the-scenes lesson here, is basically an idea that Marv Wolfman had in the early 70s at Marvel that got rejected. It was going to be the librarian. He wanted somebody who just studied everybody in the Marvel Universe, and he'd keep files and stuff. Sort of like a watcher, but a bit more academic, if you will, and stuff. And George Perez based a lot of his and the Anti-Monitor's look on the High Evolutionary. You know, he didn't make any secret about it. He had the High Evolutionary and somebody else in mind when he designed this. So this sort of was planted in, you know, some of these characters were planted in Marv Wolfman's mind, you know, since the early 70s. And then I have a magazine article here. This came out 3 months before Supergirl died in issue 7. And in this article, it's an interview with Marv Wolfman and an interview with Jim Shooter. And I've carried this since probably, I'm thinking it was May of 1985. Okay, and in here it says that they began planning Crisis on Infinite Earth in 1980 when they had a letter pop up from some fan who said that, man, their continuity, DC's continuity is so hard and so complicated. And they agreed, and Marv Wolfman was like, you know what, in 5 years, you know, it's going to be the 50th anniversary of DC Comics, National Publications. the National PO. They've had a couple of names, but DC Comics. And so he started planning on Crisis on Infinite Earths, is what he had done. They hired Pete Sanderson to come in, and he was the first and only comic book historian that's been in the business. He was hired to read every DC comic and take notes of first appearances and things like that. And they took his work and they did, DC's Who's Who. That came out December of 1984, a month before Crisis on Infinite Earths started. Why waste it? But at the same time, Pete Sanderson had gone over to Marvel, and he'd start being their historian. They ended up coming up with Secret Wars and the official guide to the Marvel Universe. Who knows what happened there. So when we start out with Crisis on Infinite Earths, it starts off with, you have never seen anything like this before at the time. The Silver Age DC Universe had started in 1956, and it was the premiere, Gardner Fox and Carmine Infantino had revamped the Flash from the Golden Age. It was the end of the 50s. DC Showcase number 4. Now, another thing to read besides that article and some other things I'll show you is that there's a great big editorial on the back in front of this, which is why I'm not, too big on trades on some things. That kind of explains the history of DC and why they're doing this. How in Flash Comics 123, the Flash of Two Worlds premiered. I think it's called Crisis on Two Earths or something. I don't know. Anyway, Flash of Two Worlds is what I think it was called. I'm getting so much to know. It's all just pounding around, bouncing around in my head. But it was, Barry Allen had vibrated in a way that he broke a dimensional plane that is separated by vibrations, and he ended up on Earth 2 and met the Golden Age Jay Garrick Flash and had a big story. That was the beginning of the multiverse, Gardner Fox. And from there, writers sort of didn't really keep track of continuity because they were under the umbrella of an editor. The editor of, say an Aquaman book and a few other books, they had their Atlantis, okay? But over here, you had the Superman books, Mort Weisinger and a couple other people, and they had Laura the Mars with the Mermaids and Mermen Atlantis. So you already had 2 Atlantises, and that's just an example. You ended up having multiple futures, the Adult Legion, and then you would have the Super Sons, the sons of Batman and Superman, and where was this taking place? And then you had characters like Batman, Wonder Woman, and Superman who had never really gone out of publication even in the 50s. Okay, so what stories go to the Earth 2 and what stories go with Earth 1? And then they just said there's another Earth. Then they started acquiring new characters from other companies. They took the Quality Comics, made it Earth X where World War II never ended or the Nazis won and stuff like that. They acquired, in the early 70s, they got the Shazam comics, and they said that was Earth S, even though they had an issue or two that, referenced Superman, and I think they had Superman in it. So it was a big mess, and everybody knew it, because Marvel had come in, 5 years after the debut of the Silver Age, and that's what DC recognizes as the Silver Age, is that DC Comics Showcase number 4. There's, in the comic book history, there's the arrival of Captain Comet and the arrival of Martian Manhunter, and something that Captain Strangelove termed the Atomic Age in the 50s. In comic book historians and big-time collectors go back and forth on, when did the Silver Age really start. But anyway, Marvel came out, and they started writing books in a way that Stan Lee said that he'd always wanted to do it, a little bit more grown up, in the world outside your window. So it was all in New York, and it was one world. And all of a sudden there's this continuity, and this had never been done before. DC, and I'm not going to go off into that history. We're talking about Crisis. So the fans started, demanding continuity. There was a quality brought to comics, and Marv Wolfman and Len Wein and George Perez and all these new guys at the time that had come up, and they weren't really new guys. They'd already been in the business for 10 years and such, but they grew up reading comics, okay? They were not ashamed of the business. They were fans of this. That's why so much of this was so good. So they were like, all right, 50th anniversary's coming up. We start doing our research, and they started building towards 1985 for this Crisis. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to do these videos, is that I'll get on Wikipedia, or I'll see some other website, or I'll hear some other reviewers and stuff, and I feel so bad because they have their facts wrong. Like I said, it's not that I know more than them, it's just that I have more resources than them, and I've remembered this stuff. I've just been collecting longer. Wikipedia says that Marv Wolfman and all the people who were involved in Crisis met a year before the book came out, and had this big meeting, and he was just writing it out. That is wrong. Okay, they started 5 years before. I cannot express that enough. And then a year before Crisis came out, Marv Wolfman had the blueprint. They had a big meeting with a lot of the editors and some of the writers and stuff, and now they're going to build this. How is your book going to tie into our main story here? Okay, and that's where all of these come in. That's where you have your crossovers and your Crisis. Roy Thomas had come over, ironically, I think in 80 or 81, and he got on Wonder Woman. Then he did All-Star Squadron, and then he did Infinity Incorporated. Infinity Incorporated and All-Star Squadron were these were his babies of Earth 2, and now Crisis is going to mess it all up. So with all the books, most of his books, All-Star Squadron and Infinity Incorporated, I think had the most tie-ins to Crisis. Supergirl was going to come in. The death of Supergirl did play out in the books. Crisis, greatest hero of them all dying. I think that's a little bit later on. Let me back up here. Okay, yeah, like number 16, the death of Supergirl. This thing went everywhere. Some crossovers were better than the rest of them, and they actually tied into the book. You would have a panel or two that would actually lead into some of these stories. The Firestorm ones, I want to say Gary Conway did these, but the Firestorm books that crossover with Crisis are very well done. Hal Jordan was one of the icons that did not show up in Crisis, yet we still had some Crisis crossovers in the coming, Guy Gardner. And then you have some Crisis books that are not labeled, which is why I think it's important to get the official guide to the Crisis, if you can find it. And some of the other resources I have, this is just a few that I've had over the years, and I bought this thing twice. Amazing Heroes from the 80s. This was actually interviews with Marv Wolfman, George Perez, and a few other people. And then I have like comic book resources interviews where they come in and they collect all the interviews they've ever had up to the top of this publication, like of George Perez. I have another one where it's just Batman. I have a couple of these. But yeah, this was all about George Perez, and he talks about Crisis and those. So yeah, it's just the resources I have that I can kind of pull together. And some of these interviews, you'll hear Marv Wolfman's, how he remembers Crisis going down, and you'll hear George Perez how he just kind of showed up and was like, "What do you want me to do?" and all, stuff like that. He was excited to be able to draw every DC Comics hero, that he could in these books.